Hello and welcome to another video with videos to fall asleep to. In this video, we will cover the history of Downing Street. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. Look at this door. If you were an alien observing Earth, or a foreign dignitary entirely unversed in British history, you would look at this door and think it belonged to a moderately successful accountant, or perhaps a provincial dentist. It is, after all, just a terraced house on a small, narrow cul-de-sac. It doesn't have the sprawling, neoclassical majesty of the White House. It doesn't have the gilded, walled-off imperial grandeur of the Élysée Palace in Paris, or the Kremlin in Moscow. And yet, behind this simple, rather unassuming black door, empires have been forged and dismantled. Wars have been declared. Nuclear codes have been authorized. And the fate of millions has been decided over cups of tea and heavily fortified whiskey. This is the story of Downing Street. And like all great British stories, it does not begin with noble intentions, grand architectural visions, or divine right. It begins with a scoundrel, a swamp, and a desperately cheap property developer. Act 1. The Traitor and the Bog. We begin in the 17th century, in the aftermath of the English Civil War. The political landscape was treacherous. You survived by picking the winning side, and no one was better at picking the winning side than Sir George Downing. George Downing was a spy. He was a diplomat, but mostly he was a ruthless, opportunistic turncoat. He served Oliver Cromwell, the man who executed the king. But when Cromwell died and the monarchy was restored under Charles II, Downing didn't just switch sides. He actively hunted down and betrayed his former parliamentarian comrades, sending them to the gallows to prove his loyalty to the new king. He was universally despised. The diarist Samuel Pepys called him a perfidious rogue, but the king found him useful, and Downing was rewarded with a tract of land just off Whitehall, a stone's throw from the Palace of Westminster. Downing was not a man who cared about legacy. He cared about cash. He wanted to build a row of terraced townhouses to rent out to wealthy politicians. But there was a problem. The land he was given was practically a swamp. It was soft, boggy, and completely unsuitable for heavy masonry. Did George Downing lay deep, expensive foundations? Of course not. He built the houses cheaply, with shallow foundations, resting on the soft earth. He threw them up as quickly as possible to maximize his profit. The original houses of Downing Street were sinking almost as soon as the paint dried. They were shoddy, cramped, and built by a traitor. It is perhaps the most perfectly cynical metaphor for the foundation of political power in existence. Act 2. The Reluctant Gift. Fast forward a few decades to 1732. George Downing is dead, and the Crown has taken back the lease on the street. The king at the time, George II, decided to offer the house at number 10 as a personal gift to a man named Robert Walpole. Now, if you remember anything from history class, you might remember Robert Walpole as the very first Prime Minister of Great Britain. But Walpole himself would have hated you calling him that. Prime Minister was originally an insult. It was a slur used by his enemies to suggest he was monopolizing the king's ear. His actual title was First Lord of the Treasury. When the king offered him number 10, Walpole did something extraordinary. He refused it. At least, he refused it as a personal gift. Walpole was a shrewd political operator. He knew that accepting a massive house from the king would look terribly corrupt to the public and to Parliament. So, he made a counteroffer. He told the king he would accept the house, but only if it was gifted to the office of the First Lord of the Treasury. Whoever held the office held the house. The moment they lost the office, they had to pack their bags. And just like that, the tradition was born. But the house Downing built was far too small for a man of Walpole's stature. So, Walpole hired an architect named William Kent to connect the shoddy little townhouse at number 10 to a much larger, grander mansion that sat directly behind it. When you look at the Black Door today, you are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Number 10. Downing Street is not one house. It is two houses stitched together like a brick-and-mortar Frankenstein, comprising over 100 rooms, connected by a baffling labyrinth of twisting corridors and uneven staircases. Act 3. The Century of Neglect. You might think that after Walpole, Number 10 became the glittering epicenter of British high society. It didn't. For over a century, most prime ministers absolutely hated living there. Remember the swamp? Well, by the 19th century, London was booming, and the Thames River was essentially a giant open sewer. Downing Street was built right next to the river. The stench was unbearable. The foundations were still sinking. The walls were cracking, the basement constantly flooded with raw sewage. Furthermore, most prime ministers in the 18th and 19th centuries were fabulously wealthy aristocrats. They had their own massive, opulent townhouses in Mayfair or Belgravia. Why on earth would the Duke of Wellington want to live in a cramped, sinking, foul-smelling terraced house when he had a palace across town? Number 10 became a neglected office space. It was used by junior clerks. It fell into such a state of severe disrepair that by the mid-1800s, the government seriously considered tearing the entire street down to build a grand, custom-built governmental palace, much like the ones in France. But this is Britain. They didn't want to spend the money, and they possessed an inherent, stubborn affection for the understated. So, they patched the cracks, pumped out the sewage, and kept the little Black Door. Act 4. The Nerve Center and the Blitz. It wasn't until the 20th century that Downing Street truly became the undeniable heart of the British Empire. The prime ministers of the 20th century were increasingly middle class. Men like Ramsay MacDonald and David Lloyd George didn't have massive London estates to retreat to. They needed Number 10. They lived there, they worked there, and they brought the entire machinery of government with them. And then, the ultimate test arrived. 1939, the Second World War. Winston Churchill moved into Number 10, and the sky over London caught fire. During the Blitz, the Luftwaffe rained bombs down upon the capital. Number 10, a poorly built 17th century brick house, was incredibly vulnerable. On October 14, 1940, a massive bomb fell on Treasury Green, practically next door. The blast shattered the kitchen windows and nearly destroyed the state dining room. Churchill was eating dinner at the time. He calmly ordered his staff into the bomb shelter, saving their lives just moments before the blast tore through the kitchen. Realizing that Number 10 was a death trap, the government built the Cabinet War Rooms, a reinforced underground bunker just a few streets away. Churchill slept and commanded the war from down there, but he stubbornly refused to abandon Downing Street entirely. He would still walk back to Number 10 to eat, to smoke his cigars, and to broadcast his speeches from the Cabinet Room, projecting an image of unyielding British defiance. If George Downing's cheap bricks survived the Blitz, the nation would survive Hitler. Act 5. The Illusion of the Bricks. After the war, the house was exhausted. It was literally falling apart. In the 1950s, under Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, a massive renovation project was launched. They essentially hollowed out the entire building, reinforced it with steel and concrete, and rebuilt the historic rooms inside. And during this renovation, they discovered something hilarious. For decades, the public believed that Number 10 Downing Street was built out of dark, almost black bricks. It was part of its iconic, somber look. But when the workers started cleaning the exterior, they realized the bricks weren't black at all. They were actually yellow. They were simply stained black by 2 centuries of intense, choking London smog. But by the 1950s, the image of the black facade was so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness that the government couldn't bear to change it. So, after they cleaned the yellow bricks, they deliberately painted them black to maintain the illusion. It is the perfect political facade. a modern steel and concrete fortress masquerading as a crumbling 17th century townhouse with yellow bricks painted black so the public doesn't get confused. Act 6. The Fortress and the Mortar. As we move into the late 20th century, the nature of Downing Street had to change again. For hundreds of years, it was an open street. If you were a tourist in London in the 1970s, you could simply walk off Whitehall, stroll up to number 10, and take a photograph standing right next to the door. But the world was becoming a more dangerous place. The troubles in Northern Ireland had spilled over into the mainland. In 1989, Margaret Thatcher erected the large, black steel security gates at the end of the street, permanently closing it off to the public. 2 years later, she was proven terrifyingly correct. On February 7, 1991, John Major was Prime Minister. He was sitting in the cabinet room with his senior ministers, discussing the Gulf War. Less than 200 yards away, parked on Whitehall, was a white Ford Transit van. Inside the van, the IRA had cut a hole in the roof and rigged 3 homemade mortar tubes. One of the mortars launched high into the air, arced over the security gates, and landed in the back garden of number 10. The explosion blew out the windows of the cabinet room, sending glass and shrapnel flying over the heads of the most powerful politicians in the country. They missed decapitating the entire British government by mere feet. John Major allegedly ducked under the table, stood back up, brushed off his suit, and said, "I think we had better start again somewhere else." Since that day, Downing Street has ceased to be a street. It is a highly militarized, deeply fortified compound. The black door behind me? It isn't made of wood anymore. It is a blast-proof, solid steel door that is so heavy it takes a tremendous effort to pull open. Furthermore, it has no keyhole on the outside. It can only be opened from the inside, where a security guard watches the cameras 24 hours a day. Epilogue. The Weight of the Door. Today, number 10. Downing Street is a paradox. It is a residence, but it is also an office to hundreds of civil servants, buzzing with press officers, speechwriters, and political advisors. It is where prime ministers celebrate their greatest triumphs, and where they retreat when their own parties inevitably launch brutal, bloodless coups to tear them down. When a prime minister resigns, they must stand on the pavement outside this door, give a final speech to the nation, and then turn their back, walking through the black frame one last time, instantly stripped of all their power. It is a brutally swift eviction. If you go to Washington, the White House projects an image of how America wants to be seen: vast, neoclassical, monumental, and untouchable. But this black door projects an image of how Britain believes it is: unfussy, pragmatic, understated. A nation that prefers to run the world from a terraced house rather than a palace. It is a brilliant, entirely manufactured illusion. Behind this door lies a sinking swamp, a traitor's cheap